My friend Lily has a cabin on a lake in WA. And one summer she brought me and her cousin Evan. It had been a great couple of days, and on the last night, like we had the past few nights, we went fishing at the lake, about a 5-minute walk from her cabin. It was about 7 p.m. and the fishing was perfect at that hour. To get to the beach, you had to walk through a small section of woods. There was a trail in the middle that during the day was occupied by women jogging with strollers and kids running to another nearby beach. Our beach was more secluded and there was no trail to get there. The hill down was steep and slippery, and on the way back it took climbing on all fours to get to the top. We stayed at that beach until about 8:30, just sitting in the dark, relaxing. We were good kids and mostly just sat on a log chatting. It was one of those weird situations where suddenly you look around and you realize that it's gotten dark. I told Lily and Evan that we should probably get home. They agreed and we packed up our gear. This was the latest that we had stayed out at the beach, so to my overactive and scary movie-powered imagination, I was a little scared. We calmly and silently for some reason walked up the hill. I told them that it was pretty creepy here at night, and then Evan made it 10 times worse. He told us a story about these mountain men who had been around in the 60s and were basically these men who lived in the woods and were in some sort of cult. He said that they had murdered people all over the area for their cult and that some were still around. Internally, I was hysterical and terrified, but externally, I basically told Evan to shut up and to stop trying to scare us. As we started to cross the trail, Evan looked to our right for some reason. He stopped dead in his tracks and looked scared. Lily told him to stop being stupid, and the two of us started to climb the steepest part of the hill. Evan grabbed us both by the arm very forcefully and made us look where he was looking. At first, I couldn't see anything and I just wanted to get home. But then, my eyes adjusted and I saw a large man. I'm assuming it was a man because of the shape, stumbling toward us pretty slowly. Who knows what his intentions were, but being kids we freaked out and scrambled up the hill as fast as we could. We all turned around at some point and saw that the dude was running toward us while we climbed. He got pretty close to us until we finally got over the hill and sprinted across the road to the cabin. It sounds fairly innocent, but we all had a deep feeling of dread when we saw him on that trail. I didn't feel like he had good intentions. Once we got to the cabin, we threw our gear on the porch and ran to the front door, and it was locked. There was a secret knock that her family had that showed that the person at the door was a member of the family or a friend. It was a fairly complicated rhythm, and both Lily and Evan banged on the door to the family knock. I just looked around trying to see if the creep had followed us, but saw nothing. We were let in and in a panic told the adults the whole story. They said it was probably just some guy who we probably made feel bad. We disagreed but felt safe in the locked cabin with grown-ups. The cabin had a walkout basement, basically like a lower story, not a creepy basement. It had a door and windows, where Lily and I slept on bunk beds. We went down to get into pajamas. After about 5 minutes of calming down together, we heard the family knock. I thought it was Evan trying to come in from the stairway door. So I said, "Come in." No response. It happened again, but this time we realized where it was coming from. The window outside. Lily and I turned completely white and stared at each other with that horrible feeling of terror in your stomach. It happened again, but a little more frantically. We both ran to the stairway door and booked it up to the living room where Lily's family were. We told them all what we had heard through panicked tears, and Evan went downstairs to listen. He said it was definitely the knock. While Lily's uncle, older brother, and older cousin all gathered flashlights to go look outside, we heard it again, but on the front door. Everyone looked at the door and huddled together. It happened once or twice more, and Lily's uncle finally decided to call the police. He said, "I'm not sure what their intentions are, but there is someone trying to get into my cabin." The knocking went on for another 2 minutes or so, and finally it stopped. 5 minutes after the call, The police showed up with a comforting loud pounding and police yell through the door. To make sure, Lily's uncle looked outside a window and saw other police searching around for the creeper. The policeman asked us 3 kids what had happened in the woods, and we told him the whole thing. The police never found anyone, but those banging knocks on the door will stick with me forever. The policeman said that it was probably just some guy who was twisted and just wanted to freak some kids out. But what creeped me out the most was the fact that that person had memorized the complicated family knock. All 3 of us slept on the floor together. To the creepy man who really wanted into our cabin, let's not cross paths again. When I was younger, my family used to rent a cottage on Manitoulin Island, which is a 2-hour drive and an hour and a half long ferry ride from where we lived, for a week or 2 in the summer. We were a single-income family and didn't have a lot of money, so this was pretty much for us when it came to going on vacation. I have a lot of good memories of staying up there. It was fun being able to stay somewhere different and to be able to experience different things. I always liked hiking on the Cup and Saucer Trail. On a cool about 15 degrees Celsius or so, an overcast day a few summers ago, we were driving around the island and my father, who was very interested in botany, decided he wanted to go out to a place where he had visited about 20 years prior. We drive for about an hour and get onto this narrow gravel road that's full of potholes. To be honest, that wasn't anything I wasn't used to, because I grew up in a very rural area in Midwestern Ontario. About 20 minutes down this godforsaken road, we start seeing signs that say things like, "Call 911 in case of emergency." "Police are just a phone call away," and "Beware of bears." A little questionable signs like that in the middle of nowhere. We continue on another 10 minutes or so, and I see these little holes in some of the signs. I don't know what they are at first, but then it clicks. They're bullet holes. My mom comments that it's pretty trashy to be shooting up signs, but it's not like we've never seen anything like that before. We get out to the point, which was our end destination, and there's nothing left there but a few busted boats at the dock and 2 gutted cabins. One without a roof and one with the door hanging off its hinges. I can see in that one it's full of torn up furniture, a couch, a table with no chairs, a mattress with the stuffing coming out. At this point, my mom and me are getting skeeved. We lived in the meth capital of our country and knew what kind of purpose a shed like that served. We could actually see needles in there, thrown in the corner opposite the door. We're still in the car at this point. My dad parks and gets out with my brother, taking the keys with him. My mom wants to leave, but he won't let us. Him and my brother walk away and look at plants or something. I think they found a dead raccoon too. While they're gone, me and my mom are sitting in the truck pretty nervous. A truck comes bumping up the road we came in, blaring rap music. They see us and stop. They're blocking the exit now, just idling there. They sit for 5 minutes or so and tear the fuck out of there, back the way they came. We're still in our truck, pretty much cowering at this point, and we can't even see my dad or brother. They eventually come back after about 20 minutes. My mom tears a strip off my dad and we finally get to leaving. I'm thanking my stars that we're leaving without being murdered by tweakers or bears when I look out the window and see the skinny, shirtless old guy just watching us with this menacing, glazed stare. He doesn't follow us and we leave him behind. I'm never going back to that point. Never. Now, this story did not happen to me, but one of my friends who I worked with last summer at the camp that this took place at, and I think it would fit here pretty well. Sometime around 2000 or earlier, my friend had gone camping with his family. He's about 5 at this time. They had gone to this summer camp that his family had been involved with for years, and were allowed to use one of their cabins for the weekend because they were on good terms with the full-time staff. Now, the camp is divided into a few clusters of cabins, all of which were pretty old and creepy and built in the early 1930s. They'd been well maintained but never refurbished, and with just mesh windows and creaky big wooden doors, they could give anyone the creeps, especially with the winter wind blowing. My friend's family was staying in one of the cabins close to the building where the camp director worked and slept. On the second day, as it was getting dark, my friend and his older brother, who was a regular counselor there for the past few years, went for a walk which led them down a winding dirt road to another cluster of cabins. They could both tell there was something wrong, but they couldn't place it. My friend several years later told me that it felt like everything looked completely ordinary, but it was like there was just something that completely threw the vibe off. His brother would attribute it to what he noticed next. The furthest cabin from the entrance had all of the windows closed. There were large wooden panels that had to be lifted up and put in the mesh windows. Then he heard a loud thud, and then the lights in the cabin were on. Now it wasn't uncommon for other cabins to be rented out by hunters in the winter, so he left it alone even though he still had a strange vibe and decided not to investigate further. The next morning during breakfast, he was speaking to the camp director and casually asked him how many other cabins he was planning on renting that hunting season, and mentioned that he had noticed that another cabin was being used back towards the far side of camp. The director had a stunned look on his face and then told him to call the police and that they weren't renting out any of the other cabins that weekend. The police showed up, and after a 2-hour standoff in the middle of the woods ended with a man in custody. For the past 3 weeks, there had been a dangerous man hiding out in a summer camp. My friend didn't know it at the time, but was later told by his brother that when they took him out, he was starving and unshaved. He had a rifle, a pistol, and a shotgun, and 2 duffel bags full of valuables that had been taken during violent break-ins over the past month in the surrounding counties. He had a desperate, violent robber hiding out in a cabin in the woods. Let's not cross paths again. This is a true story. Every time I tell it, it pulls the eyes of everyone in the room. I'm not sure why I haven't posted it before, but upon reflecting with a friend, I decided it was time to share. In the summer of 2020, my friends, Alex and Violet, and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. COVID cabin fever had hit us hard and we were desperate to get out. We settled on a mountain estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet bought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, and it was tucked in her bag as we pulled out of the driveway to make our way to the cabin. I remember this knot in the pit of my stomach, this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way we could drop acid that night. Violet was pissed. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled toward the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites, just a long, winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk gave way to night, we heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road, then the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, climbed the fire tower, and left. We'd heard there may be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside, heated some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast, and sat in the silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you're in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to white noise. Living in the city, there's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. Here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of our own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another, And finally, I'd had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, and slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen, and we were laughing, having the raucous good time we'd envisioned. Much soberer than we'd thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd all recall hearing noises in the background. The snap of a twig, the dim rumble of an engine. None of us wanted to rupture the air of nonchalance between us, so we ignored it, until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it 3 times. We were screaming in an instant. Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed pokers from the fireplace and passed them out. Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was, whatever this was, would have heard us call 911, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived 20 minutes later, a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing. They suggested it may have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We'd barely cooked those hot dogs. And why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids rather than the one closest to the pan we'd used to cook? Why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers, but they had one anecdote. As they'd sped to us, they'd come across a car at the base of the mountain, but that was the only sign of life they'd seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they'd said, and dizzied by a new horror. Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by our drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places we hadn't. We grabbed our shit by the armful and threw it inside, eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain. We followed the police, grateful every pothole found us further and further from that wretched cabin. We made it down in record time and found lodging at a seedy hotel that reeked of cat piss. Couldn't sleep. The thought of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember, there was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top. No pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower. Maybe a visitor decided to spook us during their late-night excursion. But the kids from earlier, we'd seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way. They didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence, secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare. They'd planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me. I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night of terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit in calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service. It had certainly been a welcome surprise to us. Perhaps that was a wrench in his plan, enough to spook him before he could make things ugly. In truth, I don't know if I want to know. I think I'm just content to say, midnight stranger, let's not cross paths again. It was about late November in Colorado, and I was about 7 or 8, and my father got the idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin that he was going to rent. My mother thought it was a great idea for me, my sister, my father, and my mother to bond. So that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days. We took off school on Friday to get a head start on getting there, which I had no issue with. We got there and it was sure cold. Well, it was almost December, so I guess it made sense that it was so cold. Anyway, we got all set up and decided where we'd all sleep. We ate dinner, and then we all got set up for bed and were thinking about what we'd do tomorrow. We got there kind of late, so we couldn't do much on the first day. That night, though, I heard noises outside. It sounded kind of like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I figured it must have been an animal. I tried to go back to sleep, then about 15 minutes later I heard it again. I woke my sister up, which she was about 11 at the time, and she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something out there. We weren't quite sure what it was. We decided it'd best for it not to see us, so we went back to sleep. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and so did my sister. But when we eventually woke up, my mother was inside making breakfast and my father was outside. I asked my mom if I could go outside with my dad, and she told me sure, while my sister stayed inside and waited for my mother to finish breakfast. I walked outside and my father was talking to some man, a short, chubby man. He had a shaved head and was wearing a veteran cap. He looked really nervous too, for some reason. He was sweating a lot as well, even though it was freezing outside. I walked over to him and my father. My father looked at me and said, "Oh, this is my son," and told him my name. The man looked at me and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. My name's Patrick." He smiled and looked at me. I smiled and greeted him back, and it may have been rude at the time, but I was just a kid, and asked him, "You look kind of scared, are you all right?" And he kind of coughed and replied with, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just went through shell shock. I'm a veteran," he said, as I couldn't tell already with the cap he was wearing. He seemed normal then. My father seemed to really like this guy, and I liked him at first too. He told my father he had also rented a cabin with his family and that they were really close to us, so he decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast and he stayed, and it was normal. I went outside to play after that with my father and Patrick. While outside, I fell and scraped my knee and started crying. My father was inside at the time, a bad time for him to be inside. My mother was calling for him and he ran inside while I was out there with Patrick. Patrick ran over to me and told me to come with him to his cabin because he had band-aids. I agreed and went with him. I wasn't a very smart kid. I went with Patrick. We talked about what I liked doing and I told him about video games that I played and stuff like that. Then things got weird. He asked me what shoe size I was and how old I am. I didn't know what my shoe size is. I told him, but I told him my age. He just kind of chuckled and said something along the lines of "good to know." Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was way back. It took about 20 to 25 minutes to walk there. I was tired and there was no point in getting the band-aid anymore, but I still decided to keep going since I had walked so long. We entered the cabin. He told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something. There was nobody in there. No family. I asked him where his family was, and he didn't answer, pretending like he didn't hear. He locked the door. I then got kind of frightened. He told me, "I'll be right back with the band-aid, kiddo." He walked into the kitchen and pulled one out of somewhere, and then walked back and told me to have a seat and he'd put it on. I sat down and he put it on me. He also held my leg with his other hand and rubbed up and down it and told me, "You're rather muscular, kid." I like that. I kind of got scared and immediately stood up. He asked me what was wrong and I told him nothing and that my leg was feeling much better. I then thought my parents must be worried sick about me and that I should hurry back. He insisted that I stayed a little longer and ate there. I didn't want to, but I was alone and if I ran, I don't think I could find my way back to my cabin. The door was locked too, so I just agreed and decided to eat with him and get it over with fast. He asked me how much I weighed, and I guessed around 73 pounds. He then had a smile go across his face. He nodded and said, "Perfect weight." I asked him perfect weight for what, and he just kept smiling. I was really weirded out and asked him if I could go. He told me no, and that things were just getting started and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. He had such a weird tone when he said that too. I then heard a big bang come from the bedroom. It was a closed door. Patrick stood up and looked kinda angry. He walked into the room and shut the door behind him. I then heard him yelling, "Did I fucking tell you that you could move? No, stay the fuck where you are. I have fucking company." Or something like that. He then walked out with a smile on his face and shut the door slowly. "Sorry about that, it was just my wife." She's really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today." He was smiling while saying that. I wanted to go. I then looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere, and it was really messy. He must have been living out of here. At that moment, his wife walked out of the room. "I'm hungry," she said. He looked pissed. "Get back in there," he said. His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffing and had red circles around her eyes. She looked at me, then walked back in the room. I asked him where his kids were. He didn't answer. He told me he had kids' clothes that he wanted me to try on. That was the last straw. I had to get out of that situation and I didn't know how. I started crying and then he hugged me. He told me, "It'll be okay, little one. Nothing is going to happen. Just try on these clothes." He walked in the back room. I thought that was the perfect time for me to leave. I unlocked his door and tried to leave as quietly as I could. I didn't care if I got lost anymore. I didn't want to take any more chances with Patrick, if that even was his name. I had a feeling he had been lying. He lied about having kids, so who knows what else. I was in the woods trying to find my way back. I was still close to his house, close enough to hear shouting. I heard him yelling stuff to his wife. Things along the lines of, "Where the fuck did he go?" And, "I knew I shouldn't have left him alone. You probably let him leave." I could have sworn I heard him call her whore and bitch a couple times. Then it happened. I stopped in my tracks. I heard footsteps. I went and hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. He was outside and seemed to be looking for me. I was far enough away to where I could barely see him, but I could tell he was looking for something. He then stepped out in the forest and heard him shouting, "Hey kid, it's okay. You can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes. And I have toys back in my cabin. All you have to do is come back." I then ran. I ran as fast as I could in a straight line in hopes to find somebody in my family. I was running away and I thought I heard shouting, but I didn't stop to hear it. Then after about an hour of running, I saw a cabin. My cabin. I ran to it. My father was outside looking around, looking for me. I ran up to him crying and told him Patrick wasn't a good guy and that he was really weird and was touching my legs and stuff. My father immediately called the person he rented the cabin from, and he had said that nobody had rented that cabin. My father looked at me and told me to never follow any stranger ever again. We immediately left that day and asked for a refund for the next day. The guy renting them out apologized. The man having the cabin rentals called the police, and the police went back there and checked the cabin, and there was nobody back there, not even his wife. His clothes and belongings were still there, is what they told us. Nothing really happened after that. They asked questions and left. They never called us or told us anything about him ever again. Patrick most likely wasn't his real name, and he probably wasn't a veteran. I just want to know what happened to him and his wife and how he even got a wife in the first place, and how and why he lived back in that cabin. He seemed to have lived there for a while. I guess he left because he figured the police would be coming after him because he didn't rent the cabin. So many questions that will never get answered. I'm just glad that it's all over, and I hope I never have to see the cabin man again. At the time of this story, I was 14. As well as being younger, I had developed crippling anxiety and depression. All I'll say is that I was, and still am, very vigilant about my surroundings. On this day, I had planned to stay the night at a friend's house. I had never stayed at her place before. It was always mine. For you to understand the story, I need to explain the layout of this house. It was located on a sloped hill, and when you drove down a steep road, the first part of the house you would see was big and expansive. It looked like an old mansion. If you continued driving down, you would be met with two semi-separated buildings. Both were small and run down. When I say small, I mean one of them was just a bedroom, and the other was a bedroom and a small bathroom and kitchen. No doors inside, just a piece of cloth to separate the bathroom entrance from the kitchen. My friend's room was the bedroom, and her mum lived in the other section with the bathroom and kitchen. The landlord of the property lived in the main house, the big mansion. It was located in the middle of the woods, and when I say that, I don't mean it lightly. I mean, all you could see was expansive Australian forest. Australian rainforests are incredibly dense, and if you tried to talk through, you would most likely receive some type of bite, whether that be a spider, ant, leech, etc. I'll cut to the first thing that happened. Me and my friend had walked into her mum's flat. I forgot why. I think we were either hungry or I was asking how to get reception. There was none, and called out for her mum. She was in the bathroom, and as we walked past a small window, I heard, "Yeah," coming from outside. I turned to my friend, and she looked at me the same way I was. We were so confused. If her mum was in the bathroom that was right in front of us, why did we hear a male voice coming from right outside? We brushed this off as to not scare ourselves and continued having fun in my friend's room. For a little more context, the landlord used half of her room as storage and blocked off the back section of the room with a tall shelf and a divider. There was a huge glass sliding door at the front of her room, and in the blocked of back section there was another door. You couldn't get to that door unless you squeezed through a section outside. Now, skipping forward a little to nighttime, me and my friend had to go to the bathroom, so we slinked out of her room and walked to her mum's flat. Her mum was fast asleep. We used the bathroom as quietly as possible and then exited. As we were making the small walk back to my friend's room, we saw something out in the woods. Pair of eyes, looking directly at us from behind a tree. We panicked and froze. I pulled out my phone and took a photo before we sprinted back into her room, locking the glass door behind us and drawing the curtains. It's not a reach to say we were already freaking out. We looked at the photo, and sure enough, when I brightened the image, there was what looked to be a man staring at us from the dark woods. We were extremely scared, but I called my mother, who was about an hour away, and she dismissed us. Sure, after that we were still scared, but it was a little comforting. After a while, we relaxed and chalked it up to our imagination playing tricks on us. We pulled out my laptop and put on a movie. I forget which movie, but it was some cheesy rom-com. Maybe 20 to 30 minutes into the movie, we froze and paused it. Footsteps. Footsteps crunching on the dry leaves right outside her room. We listened in horror as the footsteps moved through the tight alley that led to the back door. We both moved slowly, standing on the bed to look over the room divider. Our eyes were locked on the back door, and after a moment of complete silence, it turned. The door knob wiggled slowly before it became faster. The door couldn't be opened as it was jammed against objects that were in storage. Then it stopped. No more noise. We were crying, holding each other in our arms, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then the footsteps slowly crunched of the leaves in the opposite direction, back to the front of her room. We both didn't hesitate now, and I reached for my phone. We called the police, and after trying to explain the situation to the operator on the other end, in tears the whole time, she told us a unit was being dispatched and to stay where we were. Then, as we're still crying and hyperventilating, we heard a phone ringing. It sounded like an old landline phone, one with the harsh and loud beeping. It was coming from the landlord's mansion. We waited silently, listening to the drawn-out ringing of his phone. After what felt like at least 2 minutes, it stopped, and we heard his voice as talked to the operator. At this time, we both noticed another thing. Fingerprints on her window. These windows were slated glass that you could open up and shut with a lever. Whoever left these prints reached up, cupped their hand around the top of the glass, and dragged their fingers on the dust. It wasn't there before. Soon the landlord walked to her mother's unit and told her that the police called him. He seemed extremely upset and told her that he made sure they didn't send a unit. Her mother came to her room, and we explained the situation. Both the landlord and her mother didn't seem too bothered by the fact that a man just tried to enter our room. I couldn't stay the night, and neither could my friend. We were too scared to spend another minute there. I called my mom, and she came to get us at about 11 p.m. to 12 p.m. We dropped my friend back the next day, and when we got there, her mother told us something that I don't think I can pass up as a coincidence. The night it happened, it was raining and there was strong wind, but nothing strong enough to do this. Next to her mother's unit, she had a pole that held beads and fairy lights. During the night, right after me and her were picked up, it had been knocked down. Keep in mind, this pole was literally embedded into the cement and tied to other items with zip ties. There is no way that could have been the wind. That pole was sturdy. I still am unsure of an explanation to all of this. It may have been her landlord? I'm not too sure. It could have also been her ex-stepfather, who was pretty insane. Either way, to the man or whoever this was who tried to break into our room, please let's not cross paths again.